January 24th, 1989. A date that millions of Americans will never forget. Not because of a national tragedy or historic achievement, but because it was the day an entire nation threw a party to watch a man die. Outside Florida State Prison, in Starker, thousands of people gathered with lawn chairs, coolers full of beer, and homemade signs reading, "Burn Bundy, burn." Street vendors hawked t-shirts emblazoned with "Tuesday is Friday" and "Bundy BBQ." Fireworks exploded in the pre-dawn darkness as crowds cheered like they were at a 4th of July celebration. This wasn't just an execution. This was America's darkest carnival, and Ted Bundy was the main attraction. What happened that morning at 7:16 a.m. would become one of the most controversial moments in modern American history, not because of the man who died, but because of how a civilized society reacted to his death. For the first time in decades, an execution had become a public spectacle, complete with champagne toasts and victory chants. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, was about to deliver 2,000 volts to the most notorious serial killer in American history, and the country couldn't wait to watch. But the real story of Ted Bundy's execution isn't just about the 2 minutes it took for electricity to stop his heart. It's about the calculated manipulation he orchestrated right up until his final breath. The circus atmosphere that revealed something disturbing about American culture, and the shocking witness accounts that most people never heard. Because while America celebrated inside that death chamber, something far more complex and disturbing was unfolding. Ted Bundy had spent over a decade on death row, charming reporters, manipulating investigators, and playing games with the families of his victims. Even as he sat strapped to Old Sparky with electrodes attached to his head and leg, witnesses would later describe something that still haunts them today: the way he looked at them, the slight smile that never left his face, and the final words that weren't really final at all, because Bundy had one last trick up his sleeve, even as 2,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. This is the untold story of an execution that became a national celebration, a serial killer's final manipulation, and the 2 minutes that revealed more about America than anyone wanted to admit. In the final weeks before his execution, Ted Bundy pulled off what might have been his most calculated performance yet. The man who had spent years denying his crimes suddenly became a fountain of confessions, claiming responsibility for murders across the country. But investigators quickly realized this wasn't genuine remorse. This was Bundy's final manipulation, a desperate attempt to buy time by dangling information that families of missing women desperately wanted to hear. Detective Bob Keppel, who had been hunting Bundy for over a decade, received a call that chilled him to the bone. Bundy wanted to make a deal. He claimed he could solve dozens of cold cases, provide closure to grieving families, and reveal the locations of bodies that had never been found. All he wanted in return was more time. The calls came almost daily, each one more urgent than the last. "I have information about murders in Washington, Oregon, Colorado," Bundy would say, his voice carrying that same charming tone that had fooled so many victims. But investigators had learned to see through his games. What made these final confessions particularly disturbing was how Bundy used them as psychological weapons against the families. He would provide just enough detail to convince them he was telling the truth, then demand more time to remember additional information. Parents who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters suddenly found themselves hanging on every word from their child's killer. It was emotional torture disguised as cooperation, and Bundy seemed to enjoy every moment of it. The most shocking confession came just days before his scheduled execution. Bundy admitted to killing 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime he had denied for over a decade. But even this admission came with conditions and manipulations. He wanted to speak only to specific investigators, demanded certain accommodations, and insisted on controlling every aspect of how the information was released. Even facing certain death, Bundy couldn't resist the urge to manipulate and control. Then came the interview that would cement his legacy as a master manipulator. Evangelical broadcaster James Dobson visited Bundy on death row, and what emerged was a carefully crafted performance that fooled millions of Americans. With tears streaming down his face, Bundy blamed his crimes on an addiction to violent pornography. He spoke about his childhood, his struggles, and his supposed transformation into a born-again Christian. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to generate sympathy and potentially influence his appeals. But investigators who knew Bundy saw right through it. This was the same man who had studied psychology, who understood exactly what people wanted to hear. The tears, the religious conversion, the blame placed on external influences. It was all part of a script he had been perfecting for years. What made it particularly cruel was how it gave false hope to his victims' families, who desperately wanted to believe that the monster who had destroyed their lives had finally found redemption. The phone calls to his mother, Louise Bundy, revealed another layer of his psychological manipulation. For months, he had refused to speak with the woman who had raised him, the one person who had stood by him throughout his trials. But as his execution date approached, Bundy suddenly wanted to reconcile. The conversations were reportedly emotional, filled with apologies and expressions of love. Yet even these final moments with his mother seemed calculated, timed to generate maximum sympathy from the media and public. What investigators discovered later was that Bundy had been planning this final manipulation campaign for years. He had been studying how other death row inmates had successfully delayed their executions, learning which tactics worked and which didn't. The confessions, the religious conversion, the emotional appeals, they were all part of a carefully orchestrated strategy to cheat death one more time. But this time, his manipulation wouldn't be enough to save him. While Bundy desperately tried to manipulate his way out of death row, something unprecedented was happening outside Florida State Prison. What started as a handful of curious onlookers had grown into a full-blown carnival that would shock the world. By midnight on January 23rd, thousands of people had gathered along the prison perimeter, transforming the normally quiet town of Stark into America's most disturbing block party. The scene was unlike anything law enforcement had ever witnessed at an execution. Families arrived with lawn chairs, coolers packed with beer, and enough food for an all-night tailgate party. Children ran around wearing t-shirts that read, "Burn Bundy Burn," while their parents posed for photos with signs declaring, "Tuesday is Friday." Local entrepreneurs seized the moment, setting up makeshift stands selling everything from Bundy BBQ merchandise to commemorative buttons featuring electric chairs. The atmosphere was so festive that you could almost forget this was a gathering to celebrate a man's death. Radio stations across Florida promoted the event like a concert, with DJs encouraging listeners to join the Bundy Death Watch. WKTK in Gainesville actually played a song called "On Top of Old Sparky" to the tune of "On Top of Old Smokey," complete with lyrics about Bundy's impending electrocution. The media coverage only amplified the carnival atmosphere, with news crews interviewing revelers who seemed more excited than people at a 4th of July celebration. What made the scene even more surreal was the creativity people put into their protest signs and costumes. One group brought a homemade electric chair, complete with a Bundy mannequin, complete with his signature dark hair and moustache. Another person, dressed as the Grim Reaper, walking through the crowd with a sign reading, "Ted's Final Date." The dark humor was everywhere, from people wearing "I Survived Ted Bundy" t-shirts to vendors selling hot dogs from carts labeled Bundy burgers. The crowd's energy was infectious and disturbing in equal measure. Every few minutes, someone would start a chant of "Burn Bundy Burn," and hundreds of voices would join in. When rumors spread that the execution might be delayed, the crowd's mood turned angry, with people shouting obscenities toward the prison and demanding that justice be served immediately. The bloodlust was palpable, and it revealed something dark about American society that many found deeply uncomfortable. Local law enforcement was completely unprepared for the scale of the gathering. Sheriff's deputies had expected maybe a few dozen protesters, not the thousands who actually showed up. They scrambled to set up barriers and control traffic, but the crowd kept growing throughout the night. By dawn, State Road 16 was completely blocked. and authorities had to bring in additional officers from neighboring counties just to maintain order. The international media couldn't believe what they were witnessing. European reporters described the scene as barbaric and medieval, shocked that a modern democracy would turn an execution into public entertainment. The BBC ran footage of the celebration alongside images of public executions from centuries past, drawing uncomfortable parallels between America in 1989 and the mob justice of earlier eras. What troubled many observers was how families had made this into a social event. Parents brought their teenagers to witness history, treating Bundy's execution like an educational field trip. Some families had driven hundreds of miles just to be present when Florida's electric chair claimed its most famous victim. The generational aspect was particularly disturbing. Grandparents, parents, and children all united in their desire to celebrate a man's death. As 7 a.m. approached, the crowd's anticipation reached fever pitch. People climbed trees and stood on car roofs, trying to get a better view of the prison. Vendors ran out of merchandise as last-minute arrivals desperately wanted souvenirs from the historic day. The party was about to reach its climax, but inside the death chamber, a very different drama was unfolding. While thousands celebrated outside, Ted Bundy sat in his final holding cell, engaged in one last act of defiance that revealed everything about his need for control. Prison officials had offered him the traditional last meal, anything he wanted, within reason. Bundy's response was chilling in its simplicity. He refused to choose. Instead, he was served the standard prison fare for condemned inmates: medium-rare steak, over-easy eggs, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, coffee, and juice. The meal sat untouched on his metal tray, growing cold as the hours ticked by. This wasn't about loss of appetite or nerves. Bundy's refusal to eat was his final demonstration of control over a situation where he had none. Even facing death, he couldn't resist the urge to manipulate, to make everyone around him wonder what he was thinking. Prison guards who had dealt with hundreds of executions said they'd never seen anything like it. Most condemned men, either, couldn't eat from fear or devoured their final meal with desperate hunger. Bundy simply stared at his tray with the same cold detachment he'd shown his victims. The psychological evaluation conducted just hours before his execution revealed a man still playing games with everyone around him. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who had interviewed Bundy extensively, noted that he seemed almost excited about his impending death, as if it were another challenge to master. He spoke calmly about the execution process, asking technical questions about the electric chair's voltage and amperage. It was as if he were studying for an exam, rather than preparing to die. What disturbed the prison staff most was Bundy's demeanor during his final hours. Instead of the fear, remorse, or resignation they expected, he displayed an unsettling cheerfulness. He joked with guards, complimented them on their professionalism, and even asked about their families. One guard later described feeling like he was having a casual conversation with a neighbor rather than supervising a serial killer's final hours. This wasn't the behavior of a man facing death. It was the performance of someone who still believed he could charm his way out of any situation. The phone calls during his final night revealed another layer of his manipulation. Bundy's attorneys were still filing last-minute appeals, desperately searching for any legal technicality that might save his life. But Bundy himself seemed almost disinterested in these efforts. When his lawyer called with updates on the appeals process, Bundy would listen politely and then change the subject to mundane topics. It was as if he had already accepted his fate, or perhaps believed he had one final trick that no one else knew about. His interaction with the prison chaplain was particularly telling. The chaplain, expecting to provide comfort to a frightened man facing death, instead found himself in a theological debate with someone who seemed more curious than concerned. Bundy asked detailed questions about different religious beliefs regarding the afterlife, but not in the way someone seeking spiritual comfort would. He approached the conversation like an academic exercise, displaying the same cold intellectualism that had characterized his crimes. The most chilling moment came when Bundy was asked if he had any final messages for the families of his victims. His response was carefully calculated. He expressed regret for the pain he had caused, but stopped short of taking full responsibility. Even in his supposed apology, he managed to maintain a degree of denial, referring to his crimes in abstract terms rather than acknowledging the specific horrors he had inflicted. It was manipulation disguised as remorse, one final insult to the families who had suffered because of his actions. As dawn approached, prison officials began the final preparations. Bundy was moved to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber, where he could hear the mechanical sounds of Old Sparky being tested. The chair's electrical systems were checked and rechecked, generating the humming and clicking sounds that had preceded dozens of executions. Most condemned men found these sounds terrifying, a mechanical countdown to their death. Bundy listened with what witnesses described as clinical interest, as if he were studying the machine that would kill him. The final hour had arrived, and outside, the crowd was reaching a fever pitch of excitement. But inside, Bundy remained unnaturally calm, still playing the role of the charming sociopath who had fooled so many people for so long. He had no way of knowing that in just minutes, that performance would finally come to an end. At 7:06 a.m., 3 guards entered Bundy's holding cell to begin the final walk. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Instead of the fear or resistance they expected, Bundy stood up calmly, straightened his shirt, and actually thanked the guards for their professionalism throughout his stay on death row. One guard later described feeling like he was escorting a guest to dinner, rather than a condemned man to his execution. The walk from the holding cell to the execution chamber was only 30 feet, but those 30 feet would reveal the true depth of Bundy's psychological manipulation. As they moved down the narrow corridor, Bundy maintained casual conversation, asking about the weather and commenting on the prison's architecture. His voice never wavered, his hands never shook, and his step remained steady. The guards exchanged glances, unnerved by his complete lack of fear. This wasn't normal behavior for someone about to die, and everyone knew it. Old Sparky sat waiting in the center of the death chamber, an imposing oak chair that had claimed 43 lives since 1924. The chair itself was a relic from another era, built by inmates in the 1920s using wood from a single oak tree. Its brass fittings had been polished to a shine, and fresh leather straps hung from its arms and legs like the tentacles of some mechanical octopus. The room smelled of disinfectant and ozone, the lingering scent of previous electrocutions that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. When Bundy first laid eyes on the electric chair, witnesses expected some reaction. Fear, regret, maybe even a breakdown. Instead, he examined it with the same clinical interest he had shown. Throughout his final hours, he asked the prison superintendent about the chair's history and technical specifications, as if he were touring a museum rather than approaching his death. One witness later wrote that Bundy seemed more curious than concerned, displaying an almost scientific fascination with the instrument of his destruction. The strapping process began at 7:07 a.m., and this was where Bundy's mask finally began to slip. As the guards secured the thick leather straps around his arms, chest, and legs, his breathing became slightly more rapid. Not panic, but the first sign that his body was betraying the calm facade his mind had constructed. The metal electrodes were attached to his right leg and head, the cold copper making contact with his shaved scalp. Still, he maintained his composure, even offering directions to help the guards position the electrodes correctly. What disturbed the witnesses most was how Bundy continued to engage in small talk even as the death cap was placed over his head. The cap, a leather hood with metal electrodes, was designed to concentrate the electrical current and spare witnesses the sight of the condemned man's face during electrocution. As it was lowered over his head, Bundy's voice became muffled but remained conversational. He was still trying to control the situation, still attempting to maintain his charm even as death approached. The final words that would become part of execution folklore were spoken to his attorneys, Jim Coleman and Fred Lawrence, who stood among the official witnesses. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," Bundy said, his voice carrying that same practiced sincerity he had used to lure victims to their deaths. But witnesses noticed something else in his tone, a hint of satisfaction, as if he were pleased with his final performance. What the official record doesn't capture is what happened in the 30 seconds between his final words and the first jolt of electricity. Witness Michael Minerva, a defense attorney who had worked on Bundy's case, later wrote that even with the death cap covering his face, you could sense Bundy's continued alertness. His head moved slightly, as if he were still listening to everything happening around him. Some witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a slight smile beneath the edge of the death cap, though this detail was never included in official accounts. The executioner, an anonymous state employee, paid $150 for his service, waited in an adjacent room with his hand on the switch. At exactly 7:13 a.m., Superintendent Tom Barton gave the signal. The first cycle was about to begin. 2,000 volts for 8 seconds, followed by a brief pause, then another cycle at lower voltage. But as the executioner reached for the switch, no one in that room could have predicted what they were about to witness. Because even strapped to Old Sparky with death seconds away, Ted Bundy had one final surprise that would disturb witnesses for decades to come. At 7:13 a.m., Superintendent Tom Barton raised his hand and gave the fatal signal. What happened next would be seared into the memories of the 42 official witnesses who watched from behind the glass partition. The executioner, whose identity remains protected to this day, pressed the switch that sent 2,000 volts of electricity coursing through the oak chair that had become synonymous with Florida's ultimate punishment. The first cycle lasted 8 seconds, though witnesses would later say it felt like an eternity. The mechanical hum of the electrical system filled the chamber, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls and into the bones of everyone present. Old Sparky, which had claimed 43 lives before Bundy's, performed its grim function with mechanical precision. The voltage meters on the wall showed the surge of power flowing through the circuits, while the witnesses stood in stunned silence. What disturbed many observers wasn't just the execution itself, but the eerie calm that had preceded it. Defense attorney Michael Minerva later wrote that he had expected Bundy to break down in those final moments, to show some sign of the humanity that his crimes had seemingly erased. Instead, even as the electrical current did its work, there was something unsettling about the scene that none of the witnesses could quite articulate. It was as if Bundy had maintained his psychological control right up until the very end. The second cycle began at reduced voltage, designed to ensure that the process was complete. The prison's medical staff monitored the procedure with clinical detachment, but several witnesses noticed that the usual signs of distress they had observed in previous executions seemed somehow different with Bundy. Dr. Bell Almogira, the physician who would pronounce the time of death, later noted that even in death, Bundy's case remained unique among the hundreds of executions she had witnessed. Outside the prison walls, the crowd of thousands erupted in celebration the moment. Word spread that the execution was complete. Fireworks lit up the dawn sky as people cheered, honked car horns, and began what one reporter described as the most disturbing victory celebration in American history. The contrast between the solemn procedure inside the death chamber and the carnival atmosphere outside revealed a troubling disconnect in how society was processing this moment of justice. The official time of death was recorded as 7:16 a.m., just 10 minutes after Bundy had been strapped into Old Sparky. In those 10 minutes, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history had met his end, but the implications of his execution would reverberate for decades to come. The witnesses filed out of the chamber in silence, each carrying memories that would haunt them for years. What made Bundy's execution particularly significant wasn't just the end of a serial killer's life, but what it revealed about American society's relationship with justice, violence, and public spectacle. The celebration outside the prison gates would spark national debates about the death penalty, the media's role in creating public spectacles, and whether a civilized society should ever celebrate death, regardless of the crimes that led to that moment. The aftermath would prove just as complex as the execution itself. with questions arising about whether justice had truly been served or whether America had simply participated in its own form of barbarism. As the crowd outside began to disperse and the witnesses tried to process what they had seen, one thing became clear. Ted Bundy's final manipulation had succeeded in ways no one expected. Even in death, he had forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. The 42 official witnesses who watched Ted Bundy die carried more than just memories from that death chamber. They carried a psychological burden that would follow them for decades, a weight that none of them had fully anticipated when they agreed to serve as society's representatives at this historic execution. What they witnessed wasn't just the death of a serial killer, but a moment that would fundamentally change how they viewed justice, humanity, and their own place in the machinery of capital punishment. Dr. Belle Almagera, the physician who pronounced Bundy dead, had overseen dozens of executions during her career. She considered herself professionally detached, someone who could perform her medical duties without emotional involvement. But Bundy's execution was different. In the weeks that followed, she found herself unable to shake the memory of those final moments, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't see. There was something missing, she later told a colleague. In other executions, there's usually fear, acceptance, sometimes even relief. With Bundy, there was just calculation. Michael, Minerva, the defense attorney who had worked on Bundy's appeals, entered the witness chamber believing he understood the man he had tried to save. He had spent countless hours with Bundy, studying his case files, analyzing his psychological evaluations. But watching him die revealed something that all those legal documents had failed to capture. Even strapped to that chair, facing certain death, he was still performing, Minerva would later write in his private journal. It was as if he had turned his own execution into one final experiment in human psychology. The journalists present faced their own unique burden. They had come to witness history, to document the end of one of America's most notorious criminals. But what they saw challenged their ability to remain objective observers. Susan Morrison, a reporter for the Tampa Tribune, had covered dozens of death penalty cases. She prided herself on maintaining professional distance from the events she reported. Yet, as she watched Bundy's execution, she found herself questioning not just the death penalty, but her own role in the spectacle surrounding it. "We created a monster," Morrison would later reflect. Not Bundy himself, but the circus around his death. Every interview we conducted, every detail we reported, every headline we wrote, we fed the public's fascination with him. And that morning, in Stark, watching thousands of people celebrate outside while we witnessed a man die inside, I realized we had all become part of something deeply disturbing. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate witnesses to the execution itself. The guards who had supervised Bundy during his final hours struggled with conflicting emotions. They had been trained to maintain professional distance from condemned inmates, but Bundy's unusual behavior had broken through their psychological defenses. Officer James Henderson, who had worked death row for over a decade, found himself haunted by their final conversation. "He thanked me," Henderson would later tell his wife. "As they were strapping him in, he actually thanked me for treating him with respect. It wasn't manipulation. At least, I don't think it was. For just a moment, he seemed human. And that's what I can't get out of my head. How do you execute someone who thanks you?" The religious witnesses faced perhaps the greatest spiritual crisis. Chaplain Fred Lawrence had ministered to dozens of condemned men, helping them find peace in their final hours. But Bundy had shown no interest in spiritual comfort, no desire for redemption. Instead, he had engaged Lawrence in theological debates that seemed more intellectual than spiritual. He was curious about different beliefs regarding judgment and the afterlife, Lawrence recalled. But not in the way someone facing eternity usually is. It was academic, almost clinical. I left that prison questioning whether I had witnessed the execution of someone who was truly beyond redemption. The most disturbing aspect for many witnesses was how Bundy's execution had become a form of entertainment for the masses outside. They had participated in what they believed was a solemn act of justice, only to emerge into a world that was treating the death like a sporting event. The disconnect between the gravity of what had occurred inside the death chamber and the celebration, happening beyond the prison walls, created a cognitive dissonance that many struggled to process. Years later, several witnesses would describe feeling like unwilling participants in a larger cultural moment that revealed uncomfortable truths about American society. They had expected to witness justice being served. Instead, they had become part of a spectacle that raised more questions than it answered about the nature of civilization, vengeance, and the human capacity for both evil and bloodlust. The execution of Ted Bundy marked a watershed moment in American media coverage of capital punishment, transforming what had traditionally been a somber, behind-closed-doors procedure into the nation's most watched death. The media circus that surrounded January 24, 1989, would fundamentally change how executions were covered and raise disturbing questions about the relationship between journalism, entertainment, and public bloodlust. Television networks had been planning their coverage for weeks, treating Bundy's execution like a major sporting event. CNN provided live coverage throughout the night, with reporters stationed outside the prison offering minute-by-minute updates to a national audience that seemed insatiably hungry for details. Local Florida stations went even further, with some providing countdown clocks and playing music that celebrated the impending execution. Radio DJs across the state took requests for songs to fry Bundy by, creating an atmosphere that blurred the line between news coverage and macabre entertainment. The international media watched in horror as American news outlets transformed an execution into prime-time television. British journalist Simon Winchester, covering the event for The Guardian, wrote, "What I witnessed in Florida wasn't journalism. It was the commodification of death for mass consumption. The American media had turned state-sanctioned killing into a television special complete with commercials and expert commentary. It was barbarism disguised as news coverage. The newspaper coverage was equally problematic, with headlines that read more like advertisements for a circus than reports of a judicial proceeding. The Orlando Sentinel ran the headline, 'Bundy burned by Sparky,' in letters 3 inches tall, while the Gainesville Sun opted for 'Friday for Bundy.' These weren't just headlines. They were celebrations of death that normalized the idea that executions should be public entertainment. The editorial decisions revealed how deeply the media had bought into the spectacle they were supposedly just covering. What made the media coverage particularly disturbing was how it amplified and legitimized the carnival atmosphere outside the prison. Instead of questioning why thousands of people were celebrating a man's death, many news outlets presented the crowd as representative of justified public sentiment. Reporters interviewed celebrants without challenging their bloodthirsty enthusiasm, effectively giving a platform to what many observers considered mob mentality. The media had become complicit in transforming an execution into a public lynching. The long-term consequences of this coverage extended far beyond Bundy's death. The success of the ratings-driven approach to execution coverage established a template that media outlets would follow for decades. Subsequent high-profile executions would be covered with the same sensationalistic approach, treating the death penalty as entertainment rather than a serious policy issue. The Bundy execution had proven that death sold newspapers and attracted viewers, fundamentally altering how American media approached capital punishment stories. Television producer Mark Phillips, who coordinated coverage for a major network, later expressed regret about his role in the spectacle. "We told ourselves we were covering news, but we were really producing entertainment," he admitted in a 2010 interview. "We had graphics packages, theme music, and countdown timers. We treated a man's execution like the Super Bowl. Looking back, I'm ashamed of what we did and how we contributed to turning death into a television event." The coverage also revealed the media's complicity in Bundy's final manipulation. By broadcasting his last-minute confessions and religious conversion, claims news outlets gave him exactly what he wanted, a platform to control his narrative even as he faced death. Journalists who should have been skeptical of his obvious manipulation instead presented his claims as legitimate news, allowing Bundy to victimize families one final time by dangling false hopes and incomplete information. The international Sykes Backlash against American media coverage was swift and severe. European newspapers characterized the coverage as evidence of American barbarism, comparing it to the public executions of medieval times. The criticism wasn't just about the death penalty itself, but about how American media had transformed judicial proceedings into entertainment. Foreign correspondents wrote extensively about what they saw as the decline of American journalism ethics and the dangerous merger of news and entertainment. Perhaps most troubling was how the media coverage influenced public opinion about capital punishment. Instead of fostering serious debate about the ethics and effectiveness of the death penalty, the spectacle surrounding Bundy's execution reduced complex moral and legal questions to simple entertainment. The coverage encouraged viewers to see executions as victories to celebrate, rather than grave responsibilities of a civilized society. This shift in public perception would have lasting implications for death penalty policy and public discourse about criminal justice. 35 years have passed since Ted Bundy's execution, but the disturbing spectacle that unfolded on January 24, 1989, continues to haunt American society. What began as the pursuit of justice for one of the nation's most notorious serial killers evolved into something far more complex and unsettling. A mirror that reflected the darkest aspects of American culture and revealed uncomfortable truths about civilized society's capacity for barbarism. The immediate aftermath of Bundy's execution saw a brief period of national soul-searching. Editorial writers across the country questioned whether the carnival atmosphere outside Florida State prison represented justice or vengeance. Religious leaders debated whether celebrating death, even the death of a monster, was compatible with moral and spiritual values. Legal scholars examined whether the media spectacle had compromised the dignity of the judicial process. For a moment, it seemed as though America might engage in serious reflection about what had transpired in Stark. But that moment of introspection was short-lived. Within weeks, the focus shifted from the troubling aspects of the spectacle to celebrating the perceived closure it had provided. Victims' families spoke of finally being able to move forward. Law enforcement officials praised the successful conclusion of a decade-long pursuit, and politicians used Bundy's execution as evidence that the justice system worked. The uncomfortable questions about the carnival atmosphere were quietly set aside, replaced by a narrative that emphasized justice served and evil vanquished. The long-term consequences of Bundy's execution proved more significant than anyone anticipated. The media template established that January morning would be replicated for decades, with subsequent high-profile executions receiving similar carnival-like coverage. The Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh's execution in 2001 drew crowds of celebrants, while the execution of serial killer Aileen Wuornos attracted media attention that echoed the Bundy spectacle. Each time the same patterns emerged: sensationalistic media coverage, crowds gathering to celebrate death, and complex moral questions reduced to simple entertainment. Perhaps most disturbing was how Bundy's final manipulation succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Even in death, he had managed to corrupt the very process designed to hold him accountable. His calculated confessions, religious conversion performance, and psychological games had turned his execution into a circus that revealed more about American society than about justice. He had forced the nation to participate in its own moral degradation, proving that even the most civilized society could be manipulated into barbarism. The witnesses who watched Bundy die carried their burden for decades, many struggling with the realization that they had participated in something that felt more like a medieval public execution than a modern judicial proceeding. Their testimonies, revealed in interviews and memoirs years later, painted a picture of profound moral ambiguity. They had expected to witness justice, but instead found themselves questioning the very nature of civilization itself. The international community's reaction to Bundy's execution marked a turning point in how America was perceived on the world stage. European nations, many of which had abolished capital punishment decades earlier, pointed to the stark spectacle as evidence of American barbarism. The images of thousands celebrating a man's death became symbols of what critics saw as America's fundamental failure to evolve beyond primitive impulses for revenge. Today, As debates about criminal justice reform and the death penalty continue, the ghost of Ted Bundy's execution haunts every discussion. The questions raised that January morning remain unanswered. Can a civilized society celebrate death? What is the difference between justice and vengeance? How do we punish evil without becoming evil ourselves? These questions have only grown more urgent as American society continues to grapple with violence, justice, and the proper role of punishment in a democratic society. The true legacy of Ted Bundy's execution isn't that it ended the life of a serial killer. It's that it revealed the serial killer that lurks within civilized society itself. The thousands who gathered to celebrate death, the media that transformed execution into entertainment, and the politicians who used the spectacle for gain or participated in a form of collective moral murder. They killed something essential about human dignity and transformed justice into vengeance, law into mob rule, and civilization into barbarism. In the end, Ted Bundy's greatest crime may not have been the murders he committed, but the final manipulation he orchestrated from death row. He had turned his own execution into a mirror that forced America to confront its own capacity for evil. And in that mirror, the reflection was far more disturbing than anyone wanted to admit.